I am sitting on the concrete floor of the cold storage room in my basement, pressing my back firmly against the heavy wooden door. The lock is engaged, but the door frame is old, and I can hear the wood groaning every time they apply pressure to the handle from the other side. I have already dialed the emergency services number. The dispatcher told me that officers are currently on their way, but the nearest patrol car is miles away, and I do not know how much time I have left before the hinges give out. I need to write down exactly what happened today. I need to document the events so that when the police arrive, they will understand that the people standing in the hallway outside this room are not my parents, regardless of how perfectly they wear their faces. The day started normally. I spent the entire morning sitting in a massive, brightly lit lecture hall at the university, completing the final examination for my degree. I had spent the last 2 weeks surviving on very little sleep and a massive amount of caffeine, dedicating every waking hour to studying the course material. When I finally handed my test paper to the professor and walked out of the building, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with complete physical exhaustion. My only goal for the rest of the afternoon was to walk home, take a long shower, and sleep until the following morning. The walk from the university campus to my house takes approximately 40 minutes. The weather was clear and warm, and the neighborhood streets were quiet. Most of the people who live in this area work in offices during the day, leaving the suburban sidewalks entirely empty. I walked down the familiar roads, looking at the manicured lawns and the parked cars, feeling the heavy weight of the academic stress finally leaving my shoulders. I expected to walk through my front door and find my mother sitting at the kitchen island reading a book, and my father watching a documentary on the television in the living room. This was their standard afternoon routine, a predictable pattern that I had known for my entire life. I walked up the driveway, climbed the steps to the front porch, and pulled my keys from my pocket. I inserted the brass key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the front door open. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. My parents are incredibly strict about the thermostat. They keep the house cool to save money on the energy bill, usually forcing me to wear a heavy sweater when I am indoors. When I stepped over the threshold today, a wave of intense, suffocating heat hit my face. The air in the entryway was thick and heavy, feeling like the interior of a greenhouse in the middle of the summer. I immediately started to sweat under my clothes. The second thing I noticed was the smell. It was a dense metallic odor hanging in the stagnant air. It smelled exactly like a handful of old copper coins, mixed with a sharp, acidic scent that reminded me of milk that had been left out in the sun to spoil. I closed the front door behind me, dropping my backpack onto the floor. The sound of the heavy bag hitting the wood echoed loudly through the house. Usually the sound of the door opening or a bag dropping prompts my mother to call out from the kitchen to ask how my day went. Today there was absolute silence. The television in the living room was turned off. The radio in the kitchen was silent. I walked slowly down the hallway, taking off my jacket as I moved toward the back of the house. I turned the corner and walked into the kitchen. My mother and my father were both standing by the stove. They were standing incredibly close to each other, their shoulders touching, facing the large metal pot resting on the front burner. They did not turn around when my footsteps sounded on the linoleum floor. They remained perfectly still, staring down into the pot. "I am home," I said. They both turned around at the exact same moment. The synchronization of their movement was deeply unsettling. They did not turn their heads first, and then their bodies. Their entire frames rotated simultaneously, as if they were standing on rotating platforms. They looked at me, and they both smiled. Their smiles were wide, stretching the skin around their mouths tightly across their teeth. The expressions did not reach their eyes. Their eyes remained wide open and completely blank, staring at a point on my forehead rather than making actual eye contact. "Welcome to the residence," my mother said. "How was the academic evaluation?" my father asked, maintaining the exact same rigid smile. I stood near the edge of the kitchen island, feeling a cold knot of unease forming in my stomach. The language they were using felt overly formal, completely devoid of their usual casual vocabulary. My father always asked me if the test was difficult or if I thought I passed. He never referred to it as an academic evaluation. It was fine, I answered, watching them carefully. I think I did well. Why is it so hot in here? The thermostat must be broken. Neither of them looked at the digital thermostat mounted on the wall just a few feet away. The temperature is optimal for the preparation of the sustenance, my mother replied. She turned her body back toward the stove, using that same rigid, synchronized motion. She raised her right arm and gripped a large wooden spoon resting in the metal pot. She began to stir the contents. I watched her arm moving. She was not bending her wrist or her elbow. The entire circular stirring motion was generated exclusively from her shoulder joint, making her arm look like a solid, inflexible piece of wood. I took a few steps closer to the stove, driven by a morbid curiosity to see what was generating the foul metallic odor filling the room. I looked over my father's shoulder and peered down into the pot. The substance bubbling over the heat was a thick, dark gray paste, heavily marbled with streaks of deep crimson. It popped and hissed against the metal, sending small droplets of the hot slurry splashing against the clean stovetop. As my mother dragged the wooden spoon through the mixture, large, unidentifiable chunks of a pale, rubbery material breached the surface before sinking back into the gray mass. It did not look like any food I had ever seen. "You should proceed to your room and rest," my father said, standing perfectly still beside her. "We will notify you when the consumption period begins." I did not argue with them. The atmosphere in the kitchen felt incredibly oppressive, and my survival instincts were silently screaming at me to put distance between myself and the two people standing by the stove. I nodded slowly, picked up my backpack from the hallway, and walked up the stairs to my bedroom on the second floor. I closed my bedroom door and locked it. I dropped my bag onto the floor and sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing as I tried to process the bizarre interaction. I tried to find a logical explanation. I wondered if they had been exposed to a carbon monoxide leak in the house, causing severe neurological confusion. I wondered if they had ingested a bad batch of medication. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, opened my text messaging application, and sent a message to my mother's phone. I typed a simple sentence: "Are you feeling all right?" I sat in silence, listening closely. A few seconds later, I heard the familiar notification chime of her phone ringing from the kitchen downstairs. I waited for her to reply, or for her to call up the stairs to ask why I was texting her from inside the house. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. The house remained completely silent, save for the faint, continuous scraping sound of the wooden spoon moving against the metal pot. She was completely ignoring the device. I needed to know what had happened in the house while I was sitting in the lecture hall. The neighborhood I live in has a shared security protocol. Several houses on the street are equipped with high-definition exterior cameras, and the residents share access to a central cloud server to monitor the area for package thieves or suspicious vehicles. The house directly across the street belongs to a family that installed a very wide-angle camera mounted above their garage. The lens of their camera points directly at my front yard, capturing the sidewalk, the driveway, and my entire front porch in perfect detail. I opened the internet browser on my phone and logged into the shared neighborhood security portal. I navigated to the live feed of the camera across the street, and then accessed the archived footage from the current day. I selected the timestamp corresponding to 8 in the morning, which was shortly after I had left the house to walk to the university. I watched the footage play on my small screen. For the first few hours, the street was entirely normal. A delivery truck drove past. A neighbor walked their dog down the sidewalk. The front of my house remained quiet and undisturbed. I dragged the progress bar forward, skipping ahead in 10-minute intervals. At 12 hours and 34 minutes, a figure entered the frame from the left side of the screen. It was a tall man wearing a faded brown jacket and baggy gray trousers. I stopped fast-forwarding and watched the video play at a normal speed, zooming in on the figure as he walked down the public sidewalk. The man was walking in a manner that completely defied the natural mechanics of human locomotion. His torso remained perfectly vertical and rigid, completely devoid of the natural sway and rotation that occurs when a person walks. His arms hung straight down at his sides, completely motionless, never swinging to maintain balance. The movement was generated entirely by his legs, which lifted unnecessarily high off the concrete before dropping down with heavy, stomping impacts. It looked as though an invisible, external force was clumsily manipulating the limbs of a heavy mannequin. The man reached the edge of my driveway and stopped moving instantly. He did not slow down gradually. All forward momentum simply ceased in a single frame of the video. He stood at the edge of the driveway for a full minute, facing straight ahead down the street. Then, his head turned toward my house. His neck simply rotated in a sharp, mechanical motion until his face was pointing directly at my front door. The man walked up the driveway, mimicking the same jerky, high-stepping gait, and climbed the steps to the front porch. He stood directly in front of the door and raised his arm, then knocked 3 times. A few seconds later, the front door opened. My mother stood in the doorway. Through the camera feed, I could see her face clearly. She looked deeply confused by the man standing on the porch. She opened her mouth to speak, likely asking him what he wanted or telling him he had the wrong address. The strange man did not respond. He simply stepped forward, moving aggressively into her personal space. My mother stumbled backward into the entryway, raising her hands defensively. The tall man walked past the threshold, disappearing into the dark interior of my house. The heavy front door swung shut behind him, closing with a firm, final click. I sat on my bed, staring at the paused video frame showing my closed front door. My hands began to tremble. I grabbed the progress bar and dragged it forward, scrubbing through the footage to see what time the tall man exited the house. I moved the video to 1 in the afternoon. The porch was empty. I moved it to 2 in the afternoon. The porch was still empty. I dragged the timeline all the way to 4 in the afternoon, which was the exact moment I saw myself walk into the frame, climb the steps, and unlock the front door. The tall man in the brown jacket and the gray trousers had never left the house. I lowered the phone. I had been inside the house with my parents for 20 minutes, and I had seen no sign of the strange man. The house is not very large. There are limited places for an adult human to hide. I realized I needed to find him. I needed to know if he was hiding in one of the spare rooms, or if my parents had somehow subdued him. The terrifying alternative, the idea that the strange man had somehow caused the bizarre changes in my parents' behavior, pushed me to stand up from the bed. I unlocked my bedroom door as quietly as possible, turning the brass knob slowly to prevent the internal mechanism from clicking. I pulled the door open a few inches and listened to the ambient sounds of the house. The scraping of the wooden spoon against the metal pot had stopped. I could not hear any movement coming from the kitchen. I stepped out into the upstairs hallway, placing my feet carefully on the very edges of the floorboards to avoid causing the old wood to creak. I walked to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall and pushed the door open. The room was completely empty, the bed perfectly made, the closet doors shut tight. I checked the upstairs bathroom. It was empty. I checked the small home office where my father kept his computer. The room was vacant, the computer monitor dark and silent. The strange man was not on the second floor. I crept toward the top of the staircase and looked down into the living room on the first floor. My parents had moved from the kitchen. They were now sitting side by side on the large fabric sofa in the living room. They were sitting perfectly upright, their backs straight, their hands resting flat on their knees. They were staring directly ahead at the large television mounted on the opposite wall. The television screen was completely black. They were watching a blank display, sitting in absolute motionless silence. I watched them for several minutes from the shadows at the top of the stairs. They did not blink. Their chests did not rise and fall with the natural rhythm of human breathing. They looked like wax figures placed carefully on the furniture. The only remaining area in the house was the basement. The entrance to the basement is located in the kitchen, requiring me to walk down the stairs. crossed the edge of the living room, and passed directly behind the sofa where my parents were sitting. I descended the staircase, taking agonizingly slow steps, distributing my weight carefully to maintain absolute silence. I reached the bottom step and moved onto the carpet of the living room. I walked behind the sofa, staying out of their peripheral vision. I watched the backs of their heads as I moved. They did not react to my presence. They remained entirely focused on the empty, black rectangle of the television screen. I slipped into the kitchen. The metal pot was still sitting on the unlit stove, the gray and crimson mixture slowly cooling into a thick, gelatinous block. The metallic odor was significantly weaker here, having been replaced by a much stronger, more deeply offensive smell emanating from the gap beneath the basement door. It smelled like raw, decaying meat mixed with heavy industrial chemicals. I reached out, grasped the handle of the basement door, and turned it. I pulled the door open, wincing as the metal hinges produced a faint, high-pitched squeak. I froze, waiting for the figures on the sofa to react, but the living room remained perfectly silent. I stepped onto the wooden landing and gently closed the door behind me, sealing myself into the stairwell. The basement is entirely unfinished, serving primarily as a storage area for old holiday decorations, unused furniture, and stacked cardboard boxes containing childhood memories. There are no windows in the basement, meaning the space is plunged into total darkness the moment the door at the top of the stairs is closed. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and activated the flashlight application. The bright light cut through the gloom, illuminating the wooden stairs leading down to the concrete floor. I descended into the basement, breathing through my mouth to avoid the overwhelming, putrid stench filling the enclosed space. The air down here was incredibly cold. I reached the bottom of the stairs and began sweeping the flashlight beam slowly across the cluttered room. The bright circle of light tracked over stacks of plastic storage bins, a discarded mattress leaning against the concrete foundation, and an old, rusted bicycle. I walked deeper into the basement, navigating the narrow pathways between the towering stacks of boxes. The smell grew exponentially stronger as I moved toward the far corner of the room, near the heavy wooden door that leads into the cold storage cellar. The beam of my flashlight caught a pile of fabric resting on the dusty concrete floor. I walked closer, angling the light downward. Resting in a crumpled heap were a faded brown jacket, a pair of baggy gray trousers, and a set of heavy, scuffed leather shoes. The clothing perfectly matched the garments worn by the strange, awkwardly walking man I had seen on the security camera footage. The clothes looked as though they had simply fallen to the floor in a loose pile. I crouched down, directing the beam of the flashlight just past the pile of clothing. Resting a few inches away from the shoes was a large, pale mass of what appeared to be wet, rubbery material. I stared at the shape, my mind completely failing to categorize the object, unable to process the visual information presented in the harsh white light. I leaned closer. The mass of material was human skin. It was a complete, unbroken layer of dermal tissue, encompassing an entire torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. It lay completely deflated on the concrete, resembling a discarded, empty latex suit. The skin was pale, waxy, and completely drained of blood. I shined the light toward the top of the deflated mass. The hollow, empty face of the strange man was staring up at the ceiling. The facial features were perfectly preserved, but completely flat, the nose crushed inward without the support of bone or cartilage. The eye sockets were empty, dark holes leading into the hollow interior of the skin. Thin, patchy hair was still attached to the scalp. I moved the light down the length of the torso, running directly down the center of the back. From the base of the neck all the way to the lower spine was a massive, ragged tear. The edges of the tear were jagged and uneven, indicating that the skin had been violently split open from the inside out by intense pressure. The implications slammed into my mind. If the strange man was simply an empty skin suit discarded by a thing that had entered the house, and the thing was no longer in the basement, it meant the thing was upstairs. It meant the thing sitting on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the television, were not my parents. A loud, heavy creak echoed from the ceiling above me, sending a shockwave of terror through my nervous system. The sound came from the floorboards directly above the basement. Someone was walking across the kitchen. I quickly turned the flashlight off on my phone, plunging the basement back into absolute darkness. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, listening to the heavy, synchronized footsteps moving across the linoleum above. The door at the top of the basement stairs clicked open. The warm, yellow light from the kitchen spilled down the wooden steps, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. "We are aware of your location," my father's flat, emotionless voice called down the stairwell. The words echoed loudly in the cavernous space. "Why are you standing in the disposal area?" my mother asked. Her voice drifted down the stairs seconds later, possessing the exact same rigid, unnatural cadence. "You must come up the stairs. The sustenance is prepared. The consumption period has begun." I watched their shadows stretch down the wooden steps. The shadows did not look like human silhouettes. The shapes cast by the kitchen light were shifting, the edges blurring and expanding, revealing elongated, multi-jointed limbs and jagged, irregular torsos that completely defied the human forms standing at the top of the stairs. They were losing their grip on the stolen shapes. I did not answer them. I turned around in the dark, moving silently toward the heavy wooden door of the cold storage room located in the corner of the basement. I reached the door, grasped the cold iron handle, and pulled it open. I slipped inside the small brick-lined room and pushed the heavy door shut, twisting the old iron deadbolt until it clicked firmly into the strike plate. The sound of the lock engaging echoed loudly through the basement. The heavy, synchronized footsteps immediately began descending the wooden stairs. The pacing was deliberate, unhurried, and perfectly matched. They were walking down the stairs side by side. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the emergency services number. The screen illuminated the small, freezing storage room with a harsh glare. The operator answered, and I whispered my address, telling her that there were intruders in my house, that my parents were dead, and that the killers were in the basement with me. I begged her to send the police immediately. She told me the units were dispatched and instructed me to stay on the line and remain quiet. I lowered the phone and leaned my back against the heavy wooden door. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and began moving across the concrete floor, navigating through the maze of storage boxes, heading directly toward the cold storage room. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I can hear them breathing on the other side of the wood. The sound is like thick, wet mud being forced through a narrow pipe. "You have secured the barrier," my father's voice states, sounding slightly muffled through the heavy timber. "This is an inefficient action. The barrier will not prevent the transition." "Open the barrier," my mother says. "You must consume the sustenance. We require your biological material to continue the expansion." "They are pushing against the door now." I am typing this rapidly on my phone, sending it out to any forum that will accept the text, hoping that when the police arrive, they will read this and understand the threat. If the officers knock on the front door and my parents answer the door with wide, tight smiles, the officers will assume everything is fine. They will see a normal suburban couple in a warm house. They will not know that the people standing in front of them are completely hollow inside. The wood near the lock is beginning to crack, shedding small splinters onto the concrete floor. The pressure is increasing. "The barrier is failing," my mother's voice announces from the dark basement. "Prepare for consumption." I do not have a weapon in this room. I only have the heavy flashlight application on my phone. If the door breaks before the sirens arrive, I will shine the light directly onto their faces. I need to see what is looking out from behind my parents' eyes before they tear the back of my skin open. Pray for the police to arrive first. I have to go.